September 1897, the northwest frontier of India, one of the most volatile edges of the British Empire.
Among the troops is a 22-year-old cavalry subaltern determined to make his name, Winston Churchill.
With help from his mother, he secured a deal to send dispatches back to the Daily Telegraph. Churchill is here as both soldier and journalist.
But there's a problem. His articles appear anonymously, signed only a young officer. For someone hungry for fame, that's deeply frustrating.
Still, the frontier will soon give him the excitement he's looking for. Brutal raids, chaotic retreats, and a close encounter with death.
This is Episode 2, The Crucible of the Frontier.
Here on Churchill, the finest half hour.
Welcome to Churchill, the finest half hour. I'm Dr. Warren Doctor, and with me as ever is my own subaltern, Professor Richard Toy.
Well, that put me in my place. So we had got to September 1897. Churchill had completed this 2,000-mile rail journey from Bangalore to reach the northwest frontier. He was in the camp. There were rumors of things which were about to happen. He's also giving a little bit of a teaser to the readers of the Daily Telegraph back at home, so hinting, next time I write, I'm really going to have something to tell you about. But the writing is not the only thing on his mind. He's also got money on his mind.
That's right. He has to eat, and I think he had gotten to a point where he had grown accustomed to a certain lifestyle, and the money that he was getting, he was only making 300 pounds a year, and was supplemented by his mother by about 500 pounds a year, which, by the way, significantly less than we're being given an allowance for. Just putting that out there. So if anyone wants to sponsor.
Significantly more than we're getting.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Significantly more than we're getting. We're not being paid. That's what I'm saying. And if you'd like to sponsor us, you should. Anyway, but the whole point of this is that Churchill understands that using the press is basically about making his name. He's wanting to become famous so that potentially he might enter politics. Now, in the last episode, we discussed him getting the deal with the Daily Telegraph, as you just mentioned, Richard. But he also was published in India, isn't that right?
Well, that's correct. So there was, from Allahabad, there was a paper called the Pioneer Mail, which, if I'm correct, Rudyard Kipling had also written for. And there he was required to telegraph 300 words a day. So that does give you, again, a bit of a sense of the different technologies. He's writing these quite ornate letters back to the Daily Telegraph. They're taking weeks to arrive. They're a very literary effort. And by contrast, the ones which he's sending to the Pioneer Mail, which are going to get published much more quickly, is a much more, here's some stuff which is just bang, bang, bang.
But there is a much larger issue. So his initial aim, like we said, is to build his name and to make himself famous. But there is a substantial block to that, of course, which is the fact that he can't use his actual name.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think he'd given his mother the option to decide whether they were to be published under his name. Remember that everything is going back via her as a postbox. And she's decided that they should just be published under the title of a young officer. He thinks, well, the whole point of this was to bring my personality before the electorate, as he put it. And so he's frustrated. He writes on the 25th of October, 1997, to his mother, I've taken the greatest pains with the style and composition, and also to avoid alluding to any of my own experiences. So he's using a more third-person style narrative, and he's trying to make it very thoughtful and philosophical in some ways. But he says, my name is not attached to the articles. It is a great disappointment. Now, in fact, his mother is making sure that important people know that it's really him,
right,
including her mate, and some would say more than mate, or depends how you mean by mate, but the Prince of Wales, who's she's quite chummy with. And so she is, in her own way, working to promote Winston's career and reputation. But they're slightly at odds about how you should actually go about doing that. And
I do think it's her being a bit more clever about how you play the game, because as we'll come to see, and certainly later on, Churchill would come under quite a lot of fire for speaking quite candidly about the way the military would run things, which is a bit out of order from the military point of view. And so as a result, doing it anonymously, but people winking and knowing who it is actually probably a much better approach, which of course his mother probably knew. And that also gives us a glimpse into how London society was in the 1890s. But there's another thing that you mentioned I want to go back to, Richard, which is Lady Randolph Churchill is acting as this in between, like agent, if you will. And in doing so, that also lands her in a very interesting position for Winston, which is she becomes a censor or a manager in a sense.
Well, that's right. And so that when, of course, last time we spoke about sort of like the forward policy of trying those who wanted to be more aggressive and advance and expand the British Empire through using these punitive expeditions as a mechanism to push the boundaries of the empire further and further forward. Now, Churchill is really, in a somewhat disguised way, but in a really fairly obvious way, I would say, to people at the time, but a lot of people at the time noticed that he was advocating for the forward policy. That is to say, he was jumping into a zone where there was a lot of political controversy. A forward policy was associated with the Conservatives. Liberals tended to be against it. And so Lady Randolph sort of holds back one of these letters, which she sees as being a vehement defense of the forward policy, and she's worried that it will offend sort of the top brass of the army. And Churchill is like, no, you've done the wrong thing. He writes back to her, far from getting me into trouble, my letter expresses what is essentially the military view. So he's saying, you're acting like I'm going overboard by jumping into controversy, but in fact, what I'm doing is defending the position of the top guys in the army, which he thinks is a politically clever thing to do.
Well, right, of course, even though from her perspective, I'm going to say the society perspective back in London, it isn't necessarily the appropriate thing to do. So again, I think in a couple instances here, I think that you can see his mother playing 3D chess in a way that Churchill, being on the ground back in the Northwest frontier, doesn't quite get yet.
Yeah, I think that's true. He's obviously very cocky and very confident, and clearly doesn't appreciate often how he does rub people up the wrong way. In some sense, this confidence is an incredible advantage to him, because otherwise there's no way he would have got to be on this expedition in the first place. But at the same time, as you say, having somebody in the form of his mother to put the brakes on occasionally is maybe not a bad thing.
No, definitely, to help reel in his enormous ego. And as someone who just called someone who's infinitely superior to him his subaltern, I can relate to the Churchillian ego. So let's focus on him then in India.
Yeah. He's got to the edge of the conflict, right? And what he's trying to do is to establish his authority. He wants to be posing as an expert and conveying his expertise, somebody who's using the language which might be appropriate to somebody much older than he is, really. I mean, and he's good at it, you have to say.
No, he is, like you said, it's very interesting travel writing.
But at the same time, there's just this dimension of it where you occasionally come off it, you being a bit pretentious there, or sort of posing as some 18th century literary gentleman. And also, it should be said, of course, there's ideology in there too. He probably wouldn't have recognized it as such, but the racial assumptions coming through strongly, so that the December Dispatch, for example, amid the scenes of savage brilliancy, there dwells a race whose qualities harmonize with their environment. The fierce Pathan is at once the most interesting and the most dangerous of all the types of humanity that have been brought under the influence of British power.
Right, and I don't think it should shock anyone that this sort of Darwinist, imperialist, or colonialist language is oozing out of Churchill's words. But what I do find interesting in these words is that there's always a begrudging respect towards his opponents, including the Pathans, I would say. But I radically get the words mispronounced on account of being an American and not knowing what I'm saying.
Lean into it. Lean into it.
I own it. So It's fine. Anyway, the point is that Churchill does have this self-reflective thing. He treats his opponents as humans and as fierce warriors.
I mean, usually after he's killed them, it has to be said.
Typically after he's killed them, yeah. But that goes to my point, actually, that by discussing how fierce these warriors are, he's making himself look like a fierce warrior because he's a part of the group of people that defeat them.
And I mean, remember, Churchill writes about this actually at least 3 times over, insofar as he writes these original dispatches. Then, as we'll come to in the next episode, I think he writes them up into a book. But then, over 30 years later, he publishes his book, My Early Life, in which he's again sort of looking back on this time with a certain amount of irony, although he's not at this point sort of talking specifically about being on the frontier, I don't think, but he's looking back on life in India, saying, if you like to be waited on and relieved of home worries, India 30 years ago was perfection. All you had to do was hand over all your uniform and clothes to the dressing boy, your ponies to the sign, and your money to the butler, and you need never trouble anymore. So he was aware that he was living this very privileged existence. And in a sense, that being waited on hand and foot aspect of things, although I think it had its appeal, that was what he'd ultimately got bored with. And that was why he'd come looking for adventure. And there's, in the scholarly literature, sort of Churchill's been described as a sensation seeker, which I think is a very good description, that he was somebody who didn't like sitting around waiting and contemplating. He wanted to be somewhere doing something, or failing that, writing about just having done something exciting.
Right. And that's what I mean. You see a self-reflection in all of his writing and in virtually all of his dispatches, not just from India, but from later Egypt and then South Africa, where there is a reflective or self-reflective nature that you don't see in other contemporary writers of the time, which I've always felt like is fairly remarkable. But luckily for Churchill, he'll soon have a break from his bucolic life of being waited on by dressing boys.
And luckily for our listeners, we'll be talking about a battle after we come back from the break. Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Richard Toy, and I'm here with my Commander-in-Chief, Dr. Warren Doctor. Military metaphors aside, Churchill is craving for action, but this craving is satisfied on the 16th of September, when there's a punitive raid in the Marmont Valley. And this is a part of the so-called butcher and bolt policy, nickname for a fairly brutal way in which these kinds of raids were carried out. It basically meant destroying the tribespeople's villages and crops, in this case to punish them for the Malakand uprising.
I think we would probably today call them slash and burn tactics, like crude military language, butcher and bolt. But it's all a component of the punitive expeditions that they're on, which is, of course, the backbone of the forward policy, which I think is important to keep in mind as we're going through this.
Yeah, again, there's an interesting thing going on about the difference between what actually happens and how much Churchill is willing to convey. Now, he makes it exciting when he's writing his articles, but in private, when he writes to his mother, he's a lot more honest that this raid has actually been a disaster. And he says, the retreat became an awful rout. The wounded were horribly mutilated by these wild beasts of tribesmen. I myself fired 40 rifle rounds and hit, I think, 4 men. I have not soiled my hands with any dirty work. What do you make of that last line?
I was going to ask you what you made of it. To me, dirty work is finishing someone off.
I think you're probably right, yeah. So as far as he's concerned, like just shooting people is fine, but there are other things which he doesn't even seem to regard them as totally unacceptable, of course, but he's saying, well, I wouldn't really care to do this stuff myself, but if other people do it, then, well, at least some of it I'd accept is necessary.
But he also has this interesting thing where he pulls one of the Indian soldiers who's wounded away from the action to try to get him off the field of battle. But he also notes in that 19th century way that actually it hurt the Indian man so much that he decided he preferred to stagger down unaided.
Well, yes.
I think he was afraid that he was hurting him more than he was helping him.
Yeah, you can possibly see Churchill's enthusiasm here going a bit overboard. Again, he was pretty explicit about the fact that he was trying to get a medal, right? I mean, that's what he wasn't content just to get his name in the public prints, but wanted that recognition as well. So it's a bit like, gosh, you're terribly badly wounded. Let me help you now, dragging him away. And the guy is like, no, help, I'm fine. But he obviously wasn't fine. He'd been shot. But it also does make a point, which I don't know whether we've made explicitly before, of course, that what we're talking about in terms of the forces which were carrying out the punitive raid, essentially the British forces, was a small number of white officers, including Churchill, who's now transitioned from just being a journalist to taking a direct part in the action, but commanding Indian soldiers,
Yes.
the Indian army being made up substantially of Indian soldiers.
Right. Yeah, no, that's right. Going back to it, so this difference in the way Churchill presents himself publicly in his writings versus what actually happens, there is a very interesting incident which happens on September 18th, 1897. Now, to set the scene up, he is being confronted by one of the assailant tribesmen who they've been fighting. And he had taken out his sword and decided that he was going to fight him with his sword. That's where we'll start. I changed my mind about the cold steel. I pulled out my revolver and took, as I thought, most careful aim and fired. No result. I fired again. No result. I fired again. Whether I hit him or not, I cannot tell. At any rate, he ran back 2 or 3 yards and plumped down behind a rock. The fusillade was continuous. I looked around. I was all alone with the enemy. Not a friend was to be seen. I ran as fast as I could, and there were bullets everywhere. I got to the first knoll, and hurrah, there were Sikhs there holding the lower one. They made vehement gestures, and in a few moments I was one among them.
And the passage goes on, and he says, we left one officer and a dozen men dead and wounded to be cut to pieces. The wounded would not survive. They would be sort of killed. It is very brutal, including the brutality is on both sides, it should be said. And so the full facts of this do not get into the paper as Churchill is writing back to the Daily Telegraph. And he is somebody who is willing to cover up to a considerable extent some of the things which are going on, which he doesn't want the readers to find out about.
I think that's right. And particularly the violence of war, which would have been completely unacceptable probably in the Daily Telegraph if he had written the reality of what happened, which is why he shares it 30 years later. I also think because of Victorian society, he couldn't say, hey, look at this incredibly dangerous and heroic thing I did. He needs someone else to say that, right? He himself can't boast of what he did on the battlefield because that would not have been de rigueur. Anyway, I really want to focus in, Richard, on him saying he was one among them with the Sikhs, who, of course, in his hierarchy of civilizations had a great respect for, or more respect for, I should say, the Sikhs and the Muslims than he did sort of the other people in India, in part because of this warrior ethos. And so Churchill has, through fighting with these guys by his side, he develops a battlefield respect, and he writes about that at length.
I mean, there's this famous quote, I think, lots of good quotes in the book, but in my early life, although I could not enter fully into their thoughts and feelings, I developed a regard for the Punjabis. There was no doubt they liked to have a white officer among them when fighting. If you grinned, they grinned. So I grinned industriously. Again, there's a mixture of things going on here. There's definitely the sort of the racial hierarchy. I mean, that he has some respect for them, but definitely thinks they need to be led by a white officer, and this is something that they want. And he's not taken the trouble to learn the language. It's like, well, are we going to do gestures and grinning, or shall I learn the language? Okay, I'll do gestures and grinning. I mean, admittedly, it would have been a challenge to learn the language to a good standard. But it is true that I think is worth saying. I mean, you're in your book, which we should advertise, Churchill in the Islamic world, you make this very good point about the hierarchy of civilizations that Churchill believes in. So, yes, he does have pretty explicitly racist views, but that doesn't actually mean that he regards everybody else who isn't white as completely worthless. He does see that or believes that there are some races who have certain qualities which are desirable and praiseworthy. Essentially, the ones people who decide to fight with the British or can be persuaded to fight with the British. And indeed, Churchill did argue that Indian soldiers should be eligible for the Victoria Cross, saying, in the sight of heaven, all men meet on equal terms. There's not a belief in his part in full equality, but to some groups or some individuals, there is a level of respect.
Right, which I've always said, I mean, it's still very clearly backwards, but quite progressive, I would argue, for a Victorian in India at the time from his class. So there's a lot of relative things happening here. And also I talk about in my book him developing this battlefield respect. But at the same time, I think sport plays maybe not an equal role in that, but something of a role in that. There's lots of research that talked about the importance of British cavalrymen in particular playing polo with native Muslims and Sikhs in India as a part of almost combat training. And Churchill, of course, developed a love for polo out of these experiences. And so you can see that he sees the, I'm going to say, valor of these men he's serving with, not just in the battlefield, but also on the polo field. And that's something that he takes with him when he leaves India, I think.
Right. And again, there are elements which Churchill is keeping back from the public about this very bloody war. So there is the use of so-called dum-dum bullets, that is to say, a bullet where you make a cross at the top of the bullet, and then when it is fired, it expands in the body and then makes a absolutely horrible exit wound.
It's equivalent today of what we would call a hollow point shell.
Yeah. And so Churchill witnessed these being used, but in a letter to his grandmother, he says, the picture is a terrible one, and naturally it has a side to which one does not allude in print. The shattering effects of these bullets on the human body are appalling. Whereas when he is actually writing for publication in his book, The Story of the Malacan Field Force, he says they're no more likely to cause suffering than ordinary bullets, and their use is justified by the nature of the enemy. So he is really going in quite different directions in his private views and what he is saying in public.
Right, which again you would expect. I mean, he's obviously going to be more open with his grandmother, I think. But he also has to walk this middle line when it comes to his political views about the Ford policy, right? And so he hedges his bets both ways about whether or not it's worth it. And he even tries to formulate an ethics of frontier policy, which ultimately he considered to be circuitous and insidious as a method of defending imperial expansion. I don't know if he was ever sold on the Ford policy or not
Well,
by the end.
I would argue that he was, but was finding a way to justify it. And I think he really, private letter, he says that he's rather than coming out and defending it in a straightforward way, what he wants to do is basically to say, well, it's all rather problematic, and who can say whether it's really a good thing, but it is inevitable because we've got so far that we have to carry on now, that we've crossed the Rubicon, we have to keep going. And I would argue that this is to be seen in his dispatch of 16th of October, talking about the costs of the forward policy. He says, regarded economically, the outlook is extremely bad. And morally, it is unfortunate for the tribesmen that our spheres of influence clash with their spheres of existence. So, like a bit of irony there.
Yeah.
But retrocession is made impossible by the sheer force of solid, concrete, materialized facts. We must therefore go on.
But one of the things in my early life when he closes the chapter about the Malacan Field Force, he finishes off. I'm going to read just a little bit here that I have because I think it's quite interesting. When, however, we had to attack the villages on the sides of the mountain, they resisted fiercely. We lost for every village 2 or 3 British officers and 15 or 20 native soldiers. Whether or not it was worth it, I cannot tell. At any rate, at the end of the fortnight, the valley was a desert and honor was satisfied, right? But that line in it where he's like, whether it was worth it or not, I don't know.
Well, I think we see here a difference between the older Churchill and the younger one. I think that there's an element in which the younger Churchill is striking a pose, an ideological pose, pushing for this particular policy that he knows is controversial, dressing it up as a kind of inevitability. And I think there's, in the later Churchill, although he's not become less of an imperialist, we should stress this, I think there is some reflection, even a sadness about this. I mean, bear in mind that he's had these very traumatic experiences, he's come close to death, but this, I think, is a late form of processing, actually coming and saying, yes, this was a brave thing to do. He's actually reflecting on the human waste that has been involved and perhaps slightly regretting his own gung-ho attitude 33 years earlier.
I do think that particular passage has a nib of regret in it. Perhaps more importantly for us, though, your reflection that it's a bit of his younger self was doing a bit of trolling. I think if Churchill was a young man in today's time, he would be par excellence internet troll.
Well, except that his sentences have got too many characters in them to
That's true.
fit on a TikTok video. So Churchill wasn't finished in the Malacan Field Force yet. He also had to write up his experiences in full. Having written these letters, he was going to try and achieve literary fame through writing a book. And that's what we'll address next time.
By the end of September 1897, Churchill had survived his first real experience of war. The raids in the Motman Valley, the chaotic retreat, and that lonely moment on a hillside when he came face to face with an enemy fighter.
But he hasn't just been fighting. Throughout the campaign, Churchill has been writing, turning the violence and confusion of the frontier into vivid dispatches for readers back in Britain.
For a young officer in a pushing age, the pen can be as mighty as the sword.
And Churchill is already learning how war, publicity, and ambition can feed each other.
Because the campaign isn't over yet.
And neither is Churchill's apprenticeship in war and self-promotion.
That's next time on Churchill, The Finest Half Hour.
And in the meantime, KBO.